Hello and welcome to Book Review with a Boy, as well as welcome to What the Hey, the channel where I do a bunch of different things, and today I decided to do a book review. So in terms of how this video is going to go, I'm going to kind of talk about the basic facts of the book, who it was written by, where it's from, how many pages are in it. I'm going to talk about the characters, the setting, the general plot, and some quotes that I found that were interesting from the book, and then I'll just kind of go into my general thoughts about the book in general. So first and foremost, the actual book that I'm reviewing today would be titled Barabbas, and it was written by Lagerkvist and published in 1950. You may or may not know Parr from other books that he's written, like The Dwarf, I think in 1944, but overall, this dude was very well known as a famous Swedish author. So as I've already kind of explained, this book was originally written in Swedish per the author being Swedish, but it has been translated into different languages, like English was done by Alan Blair, so thank you, because I personally don't know Swedish. Furthermore, it was published through Random House Incorporated, and it's roughly 180 pages of a historical novel, so if you like history and you like the fact that it's 180 pages, it's really not that much to get through. In terms of the setting where characters go and where things take place, overall it's a broad sense of like Mediterranean and Western Asia, but there are specific places like Golgotha, Rome, the Jordan Valley, Jerusalem, and the Gate of David that are specifically mentioned in the book, but overall it's kind of like a Mediterranean feel, at least that's what I got from reading it. Now, in terms of the characters of the book, before I discuss the plot and how the characters actually interact, there's a lot of just general people that show up that don't necessarily get names, or it's like crowds of people that the characters interact with, but there are quite a few that do get specific titles. And I have a list on my phone, so I'll read that now. But as per the title, the main character of the book would be Barabbas, who essentially goes through this like momentous journey of essentially like questioning kind of his entire life, so he's the main character. The next main character of the book would be Jesus of Nazareth, and even though he's only like in the first little chunk of the book, he's kind of like an overarching consideration, I guess you would call it, for Barabbas, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. The next good chunk of characters that show up throughout this book were kind of like associates, family, and followers of Jesus of Nazareth, because Barabbas meets them and he's like, I didn't meet Jesus, who was this dude? And they're like, we met Jesus, here's stories about this dude. But these kinds of characters range from like Mary Magdalene, Saint Veronica, Simon of Cyrene, and Joseph of Arimathea, so they are all kind of like, well, here's what I experienced when I met Jesus. Here you go. But other than those characters that have specific names, there are other people that show up, like Girl with the Hair Lip and the Fat Woman, like those are their actual names given to them in the book. And then there's other characters like Eliahu, they're overseers and mine leaders at this job that Barabbas eventually goes to. And then there's this other character called Sahak that Barabbas kind of like develops a relationship with, like a friendship and stuff, and that's interesting. But that's just kind of the general character list that I got from reading this. I tried to like note down all of the names that came up, and that's kind of what I got. So next, what I'm going to do for this review is I'm going to read off the synopsis that the book has for its own plot, which I'm definitely someone who misses when all books had like a brief little summary of what the book was actually about. Now it's all just reviews, which this book does have some of those, but it also like gives a description of what the book is. So I'll read that, but then I'll also give my own kind of summary of what I got from the book, just so you know whether or not you'd like to read it. And I'll probably give some spoilers, kind of very vague spoilers, so if you don't want to know what happens at the end, I guess skip this part, but you know, here we go. So according to the summary on this book, I'm not sure who wrote it, maybe Parr did, I don't know, but it says Barabbas is the acquitted, the man whose life was exchanged for that of Jesus of Nazareth, crucified upon the hill of Golgotha. Barabbas is a man condemned to have no God. Christ Jesus is carved on the disc suspended from his neck, but he cannot affirm his faith. He cannot pray. He can only say, I want to believe. And that's what that says. Which to me in general, that's kind of an overarching, like very vague way to describe the book, because that's definitely in there, but now I'll actually give some plot points of what happens. So at the beginning of this book, we are introduced to the character known as Jesus of Nazareth, who was essentially given the title and also called himself the Son of God, because according to this book, he came to earth and did all these miracles, but there were religious leaders who were basically like, we can't have you saying that because that's essentially blasphemy, like you can't call yourself the Son of God or like a god in general, because we have like Roman and really high up leaders who essentially consider themselves gods, so that's blasphemy and we gotta kill you. Now, where Barabbas comes in is the fact that he's essentially swapped out for Jesus of Nazareth in terms of being executed, because Barabbas was going to be executed because he's like killed a bunch of people, but at the time of Jesus being put on trial, everyone was like, we want Jesus of Nazareth to die instead of Barabbas, even though Barabbas like literally sucks. So that's where he comes in, which I know, not a great start for like the main character of the book. It's a dude who's killed a bunch of people, but you know, that's how it starts. So once Barabbas is kind of aware of the fact that he's not going to be executed, this other guy was, he basically has this question of like, why wasn't I executed? Who was this dude? What in the world just happened? There's also a point early on in the book where Barabbas becomes apparent of the fact that there are a lot of people that worship Jesus. So basically the whole start of the book is Barabbas just being generally confused as to why he wasn't executed, whereas this other guy who apparently did nothing wrong was executed. And with going into detail, but not really any detail at all, the majority of the book past Jesus's execution in the beginning and Barabbas being set free, a majority of what the book is about is basically Barabbas's travels of like meeting different people who either heard or saw Jesus and asking, who was this actual dude? Because I never met him, but a lot of people talk about him and are kind of salty that I wasn't killed and he was. And what Barabbas encounters, as I already kind of mentioned, is a lot of people, especially Jesus's followers, who are really angry towards Barabbas because they were like, you essentially let like this guy that we worship die. Like, how could you? Like, you should have been there instead of him. But on the other hand, there are some characters that Barabbas meets that are essentially like, well, here's why I believed in Jesus, and here's like the good message of like Christianity and like the love of Jesus. And like what you did isn't necessarily something that you could have prevented, it just happened. And essentially, after every interaction that Barabbas has with the character, he's still confused, like he doesn't exactly get why people still worship and like appreciate what Jesus did. Like his whole thing is that he wants to believe, but he can't fully believe, at least for a majority of the book, because he just doesn't really get it. And towards the end of the book, there's this whole segment about Barabbas having to go work in these copper mines with this character named Sahak, I think is how you say his name, and they both kind of form this awkward kind of relationship because Sahak believes in Jesus and like the good message that he had or whatever, and Barabbas is like, I don't really care and I don't really agree, but I don't really have anything like bad against you, so I guess we're friends. And it's very interesting because in this last section of the book, you have two different characters who are kind of slaves in these copper mines, and they talk about like what they think about Jesus, and Sahak like definitely believes, he's like, Jesus was a good person, I believe in what he did, whereas Barabbas is like, I kind of was exchanged and like didn't die and he died for me, I guess, but I don't really believe, like it's just this good dude who died, I guess. And it's very interesting because at least in the first part of their relationship, Sahak believes that Barabbas is really into the whole Jesus thing and thinks that he likes Jesus as well. But then Barabbas is essentially kind of like confessing like, I don't really care, I don't believe. And Sahak kind of gets depressed about that. But he's still like, I guess we're friends. Like, I'm not going to hate you for that. You believe if you want to, I guess. And then later, after a good while, Barabbas and Sahak kind of have this good reputation of like working in the copper mines. So this like guard of the copper mines takes them to meet this Roman emperor, and he's like, do y'all want to work in my palace? And if you want to, you kind of have to like give your undying faith to me and basically believe I'm a god. And Sahak is like, I don't believe that, and he essentially gets executed. And it's very interesting because basically at the very end of the book, spoiler alert, Barabbas also gets executed because although he didn't initially say that he believed in Jesus, he essentially does in the end, because he's like, I'm not gonna say that a Roman emperor like dude is God, so you know, I don't believe, get wrecked, I guess. So it's kind of ironic because in the beginning, Barabbas is saved from being crucified on a cross, but he dies by being crucified on a cross later. So I guess it just prolonged the time that that was gonna happen. So before I go into my opinions about this book, I did want to mention that there is a movie/film adaptation of this book. I'll try to find a link to like go watch it if you want to, because sometimes I'm really not a read-y kind of person. I like to just watch stuff. So if that's you, I'll try to put some information or a link to it so you can go watch it if you want to. Next, I would like to list some quotes that I thought were interesting from the book. I'll probably put the rest of them in the actual description of this video, so if you would like to see what I thought was interesting, feel free to look at that. You don't have to. That's up to you. So some of the quotes that I thought were interesting came not only from Barabbas, but other characters that were kind of discussing why Jesus let himself actually be crucified. One was, "A Messiah who lets himself be crucified, did you ever hear the like?" Another one was, "For if he really was the Son of God, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to get out of it, but he didn't want to get out of it." Another one that I thought was really interesting was that he said, if he was a savior, why didn't he save? Which essentially was kind of along the same lines of like, if he like could save other people, why didn't he save himself? This was one that I thought was funny in terms of describing Barabbas, and it said, and there was one thing about Barabbas, even if he didn't care for you, he didn't care for anyone else either, you could always be sure of that. So that's kind of like a negative way to describe someone, but I guess at least he's consistent. So in terms of my general opinion, I really like the book. The reason why I have this book at all is really only because it was free, for one thing, but it was on my university's like campus, like one of the buildings I go to for classes, and there's a bookshelf where people, like students, just put books there when they're done with them, and this happened to be there, and I was like, that seems interesting. I also have like a religious upbringing, and I'm familiar with stuff like this, and I was specifically interested in this because if you're familiar with like the Bible or other texts that bring up Barabbas, he's really only mentioned in the context of one being a murderer, but only really being present when he's kind of swapped out so that Jesus, like Jesus of Nazareth, can be crucified. So I was like, is this book actually legit? Does it talk about what he was about? Because I didn't know. And I mean, really the only con that I have with this book is that it's not entirely legit. Of course, it kind of talks about the whole part about like Jesus being crucified, but I tried to do some research and there's no other really records of who Barabbas was or what he did after he was like set free. So I was a little disappointed to know that this book wasn't entirely based on fact. Like, he did go to a copper mine and was like later executed. We don't know, I guess, or at least I couldn't find anything that said that that happened. But overall, interesting story. I definitely don't think that you have to be someone who is like religious or you have to know a lot about this stuff to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or like, sure, I care about this book. I think it is a general interesting kind of perspective for people who, like, if you're someone who is outside of a religion, like wondering why all these people believe this stuff, you can kind of put yourself in Barabbas's shoes, even though I hope like you haven't killed someone, I guess. So yeah, overall, I think it's a very interesting book to kind of look into that kind of perspective, especially from Barabbas, because it was like a lot of the characters that he meets kind of like hate him initially, but he genuinely is kind of like, well, I don't know who Jesus was, please explain, because I don't know. In terms of the actual character of Barabbas, he's kind of nonchalant throughout the entire thing. Like, he does show some emotion, but a majority of his character is just questioning, like, why did this, like, even happen to him? Like, he's just where he's at, and it happened, I guess. I think in terms of my favorite character in the book, it would probably be Sahak, however you say his name. Love him because he's just like this super nice guy that meets Barabbas and is like, oh, you know about Jesus? Oh my goodness, he died instead of you? That's interesting. But he's just like a very nice character that Barabbas just happens to meet, and they kind of become friends, even though that's later disrupted. But I really like that character, I think, more than anyone else in the book. Once again, it's a little disappointing because you don't know whether or not these characters that Barabbas met were real. You just kind of have to assume for the narrative and plot of the book, it's like, oh, that makes sense, or it's like, oh, that's cool to consider, I guess. I may try to watch the film at some point. I haven't yet. I did like the book, so I'm assuming I'd like the film, but you know, sometimes the film adaptations aren't that great, but you know, what can you do? So yeah, overall, if you're not someone who's like into historical stuff, that doesn't necessarily have to be a thing for this book. Sure, it has historical context and like people you may know from history, but you don't really have to know too much or like really like it to read it. You also don't necessarily have to be someone who's in religion. It's kind of like this deals with religious stuff, but it's kind of from the perspective of someone who like is on the outside of it, looking in, like going to like religious meetings and being like, well, this is interesting. So I think it's kind of a good book for really anyone. Like, you know, if you're interested in it, there you go, even better, I guess. And I'll try to remember to find a link, so if you would like to read this book, you can. I would assume it's not that expensive. Maybe it is. It doesn't say how much it is in the book. But you know, I'll try to remember to put a link for the book in the description if you'd like to read it. Really not that long, like the chapters and everything are kind of spaced out really well. Text is kind of big, so you know, if you're not big brain in reading like I am, it's a great book. But yeah, that's essentially it. And if you have any questions about the book, like anything more in depth than what I talked about, because I kind of talked about it all vague. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. And that's about it. So thank you very much for watching. Bye.